Hello, my name is Nancy Tran, and today I'm going to be presenting on El Salvador. So, as a general overview of my presentation, I'm going to start off with a short introduction that includes some facts about the geography of El Salvador, as well as some background history about the nation. And then I'm going to go into more specific topics, which include politics, nationalized healthcare rights, specifically reproductive healthcare, and then my last topic will be the cultural practices of the people, which originate from the PPO. So I'm going to start off with a bit about the geography of El Salvador. El Salvador is a country that is located below the borders of Guatemala and Honduras. It is a very small country. It is 270 kilometers wide and 142 kilometers long. It's actually the smallest in land area in Central America, as well as the most densely populated country in Central America. So as of July 2017, the population was 6,172,011 people. As for the physical geography of the country itself, it's mostly mountains with a coastal belt and central plateau. Also, since it's near a tectonic plate, it makes it very susceptible to regular earthquakes. And since there are a few volcanoes in the country, there's also a chance for possible volcanic eruptions. The capital is San Salvador, and the current president is Salvador Sanchez Cerén. As for the demographics of the country, about 86.3% of the population identify as mestizo, 12.7% identify as white, and 0.2% identify as indigenous or another ethnic minority. So many Salvadoran refugees and immigrants that we see today come from two events. The first one here is from the earthquakes in 2001. So since I mentioned earlier that El Salvador is located near a tectonic plate, that triggered two earthquakes around January 2001 that had left about 1,200 people dead and caused a lot of damage to houses and buildings. And then the second event that I'm going to be talking about, that's a major event in the history of El Salvador, is the Salvadoran Civil War. So what led up to that? Well, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there were the 14 families. And who were the 14 families? Well, they were the economic elite who controlled the majority of the land and wealth in El Salvador. So that led on throughout history and created more corruption and violence throughout the nation. And that led up all the way until 1979, when the military decided to start a coup and kicked out the president at the time, General Carlos Humberto Romero, out of office. So from then on, the government was led by the military until 1980, and people state that the assassination of Archbishop Romero and the establishment of the FMLN, or the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, was the start of the Civil War. So the FMLN was a combination of 5 guerrilla groups, leftist groups, and ultimately the war was between the FMLN left wing and the military-led government. January 10th, 1981 was when the FMLN launched its first full-fledged military strike against the government, and that was when the United States intervened with military support for the counterattack, because at the time they viewed the FMLN as a communist regime and they were afraid that they would take over. So after that, there were many massacres. Many people died in the conflicts, including civilians and political leaders. And then the Civil War finally ended in 1992. So overall, it was 12 years long from 1980 to 1992. And it ended after the Chapultepec peace accords were signed. So overall, the earthquakes as well as the Salvadoran Civil War has led to the Salvadoran migration in the United States. So the spike in migration had occurred by 1990, where many people moved to the United States in order to apply for asylum due to political violence and poor economic conditions, as well as to avoid fighting in the war. And since 2001, Salvadorans have been eligible to receive temporary protected status, which allows them to live in the United States. However, in more recent years, many Salvadorans are at risk for not having their protected status extended, which puts them at risk for deportation. So that was a bit about the historical context. So the role of gangs in El Salvador has on its way been more politicized. After the war had ended in 1992, the country was still divided. So there was a split between the left-wing FMLN and the right-wing group Arena. So in 2014, when Salvador Sanchez Cerón, a former guerrilla and rebel leader of FMLN himself, had won the presidential election, he had won against the right-wing group Arena by a really small margin of 50.11% to 49.89%. And this rivalry has given the chance to gangs to enter the political system. So these street gangs are known as Mara street gangs in El Salvador. They've left the country with one of the highest murder rates in the world. So now there have been fears that Maras may increase violence in order to pressure President Sanchez for negotiations. And many of these gangs have been former street gangs in Los Angeles. So the Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and Barrio 18 have become political actors in El Salvador. So the prison system in El Salvador, they're pretty much run by the gangs themselves. And after prisoners in El Salvador were no longer segregated, they had formed a prison pact. So Mara 503 was formed, and it intended to seek greater political influence through participation in elections, controlling local elected officials, and infiltrating both police and military forces. So how did they do this? They did this through pressure, by means of force, getting people to vote for the party that they negotiated with. And this, to me, is important because throughout Central America specifically, this has been an ongoing issue with gangs. They really contribute to the crime rate and the political systems in these countries. So overall, in El Salvador, gang-related violence and homicides are known to be really common. So in this photo on the left, you can see a grandmother and her grandson walking past graffiti by the Barrio 18 gang in San Salvador. And this is despite anti-gang measures by the government, including use of the army in public activities, increased flexibility in search and seizures, and stricter security in prisons. Even though the government has imposed all of these measures, crime continues to rise. And to me, it's important to bring awareness to these issues, since violence has taken over the daily lives of the people in El Salvador, and it's really unfair for them to wake up and for the children to go to school or to leave their homes and not knowing whether or not they'll be safe. The next topic that I'll be covering is nationalized healthcare rights, specifically reproductive health and rights in El Salvador. So the photo on my left is one of the creative portions that I did for my case study. It's supposed to be an example of a conversation between two girls about preventing pregnancies and the use of contraceptives in El Salvador, as well as the health issues that have risen because of Zika. By the end of their conversation, they remember that abortion is illegal in El Salvador. Also, this table on the right are some facts and statistics of reproductive health indicators for El Salvador. So, reproductive health, rights, and education vary throughout the country. Especially for indigenous populations throughout Central America as a whole, reproductive health care is most likely to be very limited. And in El Salvador specifically, the prevalence of contraceptive use is 72%, the prevalence of prenatal care is 96%, and the percentage of births attended by birthing attendants is 98%. 7 out of 10 sexually active adolescents from the ages of 15 to 19 become pregnant, while 47% of those pregnancies are unplanned. Also, in a study among adolescents in El Salvador, the adolescents had believed that sexual and reproductive health and rights were not fully guaranteed to them, despite its ability to reduce the risk of early pregnancy by 66%. This is due to insufficient information by schools or other sources, as well as limited control over their lives and relationships due to societal and familial restrictions such as machismo. And in El Salvador, although there was no knowledge regarding contraceptives, there were 3 major barriers to its access: limited information, limited contraception services in health centers, and limited knowledge of contraceptive effectiveness. During the Zika outbreak that had occurred in 2016, Deputy Health Minister Eduardo Espinosa had advised against pregnancies. However, there was no change in reproductive health education. Currently in El Salvador, abortion is illegal and a miscarriage can lead to 30 years in jail. So this photo on the right pictures lawyers and women's rights activists representing a 19-year-old girl, Evelyn Beatriz Hernandez Cruz, and she had been imprisoned for 30 years due to having a miscarriage. There's also been a lack of effort by the government for sexual reproductive health services, and only 12.3% of adolescents reported to using family planning services, STI counseling, and prenatal care. Girls who have given birth have expressed dissatisfaction with clinics such as the one pictured on the right due to poor bedside manners, lack of privacy, long wait times, as well as a lack of restrooms. Therefore, this overall indicates a need for coordination between the ministries of health in El Salvador, education, labor, and social protection. The last topic that I'm going to be discussing is cultural practices associated with one group, and the group that I'm going to be talking about specifically is the Pipil. Background information. As you may know, in El Salvador, the majority of the population refer to themselves as being ethnically mestizo. One group in particular, the Pipil, remains as one of the oldest minority groups to remain in the country. They're loosely related to the Aztecs, however, their culture has been rapidly diminishing despite its influence in the nation's culture. Salvadoran Spanish also contains traces of a dialect called Nahuat, which is considered a critically endangered language with only about 200 speakers. So in this video, you can briefly see school children singing the national anthem in Nahuat. So on this slide is a brief narrative about the teachings of the Nahuat Pipil in El Salvador. So in summary, throughout history, the Pipil were strongly tied to the land and religion, asking the gods before moving from one mountain to the next. Agriculture and farming were a huge part of their life, specifically corn and cacao. However, commercial agriculture after Spanish colonization had forced them to move away from their towns into the countryside. Today, many believe that the Pipil have disappeared, although there are still a few remaining who still speak the native language, and contemporary Salvadoran life is largely influenced by Pipil culture and music. So for some fun facts, since the Pipil had corn as being a major part of their agriculture, Salvadoran cuisine also contains a blend of Spanish and Pipil traditions using corn. So that dish that you see in the slide is sopa de pata, which is a Salvadoran soup of cow's feed, tripe, and sweet corn. Very, very delicious. In addition, herbal medicine is still used by curanderos, especially in rural communities, which has indigenous roots. So listed at the bottom of the slide are some examples of herbal remedies. And also for fun, since I really like music, on the left are some instruments that originated from the Pipil, and the left shows basically a list of a few examples. So to wrap up my presentation, what I learned the most about El Salvador is that, like the rest of Latin America, El Salvador is a rapidly urbanizing nation, but it has also been affected by its civil war and natural disasters, which adds more to its rich history and past. El Salvador has similarities to the rest of Latin America due to its strong ties in families, relationships, and societal values, as well as the increase in activism for more social justice. It is also unique in the way that the Salvadoran Civil War has divided the country into two between the left and the right, and gangs have played a much larger role in politics. Also, it is unique in the way that it shares deep roots with its indigenous past, such as with the Pipil culture and the language and the food of El Salvador. The future of the country, to me, will hopefully get better as there are more United States Salvadoran citizens and people from all around the world are brought to more awareness of El Salvador. Hopefully there will be an increase in social justice, as well as more people and organizations fighting for education and health rights. And this project overall has helped deepen my understanding of Latin America because it made me realize that Latin America is definitely a multidimensional region that has a large spectrum between the poor, the elite, as well as the different areas in Latin America and how equality and privileges range from person to person. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. These are my sources, and once again, thank you for listening.